Kinesiology. Chapter 4, Part 2, Flexibility. Flexibility, Part 2, Chapter 4. It's a little graph. Effects of aging: muscular atrophy, neural atrophy, connective tissue hypertrophy. Ooh, that means tissue is getting bigger. Increased tissue stiffness, tissue dehydration. Oh, effects of aging. So drink more water. Maybe that'll help. Immobilization has varying effects on tissue. Studies have demonstrated that a muscle's resting length and its length tension properties will change if the muscle is immobilized in a lengthened or shortened position for an extended period of time. When a muscle is immobilized in a shortened position, there is a reduction in fiber length due to 40% reduction in sarcomeres concentration and an increase in the proportion of the connective tissue. When a muscle is immobilized in a shortened position, there is a reduction in fiber length due to a 40% reduction in sarcomeres concentration. So the muscles get shorter. And an increase in the proportion of connective tissue, resulting in reduced tissue extensibility and loss of joint range of motion that leads to altered length tension relationships, altered force coupled relationships, altered joint arthrokinematics, and abnormal movement patterns. Effects of immobilization. Effects of immobilization: altered length tension relationships. Effects of immobilization: altered force coupled relationships. Effects of immobilization: altered arthrokinematics. The effects of immobilization also have altered neuromuscular control, cartilage degeneration, effects of immobilization, loss of ground substance. Ooh, ground substance. The reduction in a muscle protein occurs quickly, at half time of 4 to 6 days. Conversely, when muscle is immobilized in a lengthened state, sarcomere concentration increased by as much as 20% with a corresponding increase in force output despite being immobilized. So things that are lengthened, if you had to keep your arm out, it actually increased. If your arm is extended, so this side is lengthened, this side is shortened. Triceps are lengthened, so the triceps actually gain sarcomere concentration when they're lengthened. Okay. Remember that sarcomeres are the contractile element. Atrophy at a faster rate than non-contractile connective tissue and fascia. Remember that sarcomeres are the contractile element. Atrophy at a faster rate than non-contractile connective tissue and fascia. Immobilization also results in cartilage degeneration. Articular cartilage is highly specialized connective tissue with high tensile strength. It needs stress to stay healthy. Movement is necessary to remodel tissue along the lines of stress. Movement is necessary to remodel tissue along the lines of stress. If appropriate weight bearing does not occur over the entire surface area of the cartilage, the tissue will weaken and atrophy. So that's the articular cartilage that will atrophy. It will actually break down when there's not stress placed upon it. I say it goes for the brain too. If appropriate weight bearing does not occur over the entire surface area of the cartilage, the tissue will weaken and atrophy, while the areas being overstressed will wear away permanently. While the areas being overstressed will wear away prematurely. While the areas being overstressed will wear away prematurely, if they go away quickly and suddenly. Premature. Further complications of immobilization include a loss of ground substance. Ground substance is a connective tissue matrix that houses tissue and cells, glycosaminoglycans, and mucopolysaccharides. A connective tissue matrix. Ground substance is a connective tissue matrix that houses tissues and cells, glycosaminoglycans, and mucopolysaccharides that in articular cartilage function to lubricate the connective tissue, providing a critical interfiber distance that aids in diffusion of nutrients while acting as a mechanical barrier against bacteria. What is diffusion? Nutrients. Define. Spreading of something more widely. The action of spreading the light. So it must be spreading. Let me see. A connective tissue matrix. Ground substance is a connective tissue matrix that houses tissues and cells, glycosaminoglycans, and mucopolysaccharides that in articular cartilage functions to lubricate the connective tissue, providing a critical interfiber distance that aids in the diffusion of nutrients. So it must be spreading out the nutrients. So articular cartilage functions to lubricate the connective tissue, providing a critical interfiber distance that aids in diffusion of nutrients while acting as a mechanical barrier against bacteria. Wow. That is, so ground substance is a connective tissue matrix that houses tissue and cells that in articular cartilage functions to lubricate connective tissue, providing a critical interfiber distance that aids in diffusion of nutrients while acting as a mechanical barrier against bacteria. Immobilization decreases the ground substance, which significantly affects the normal function of the soft tissue complex. Decreased connective tissue lubrication. Results of loss of ground substance. Results of loss of ground substance. Results of loss of ground substance. Results from loss of ground substance. Why not from? Decreased connective tissue lubrication. Results from loss of ground substance. Loss of ground substance does this: decreased connective tissue interfiber distance, decreased nutrient diffusion, spreading out nutrients, decreased mechanical barrier against bacteria. Results from loss of ground substance, decreased mechanical barrier. So you want a good amount of ground substance. Soft tissue biomechanics. Soft tissue demonstrates several unique properties. Elasticity is the spring-like behavior of connective tissue that enables the tissue to return to its original shape or size when forces are removed. Snaps back. Elasticity snaps back, returning to. The soft tissue of the kinetic chain demonstrates an elastic limit, which is the smallest value of stress required to produce permanent strain in the tissue. The soft tissue of the kinetic chain demonstrates an elastic limit, which is the smallest value of stress required to produce permanent strain in the tissue. Below this elastic limit, the soft tissue returns to its original length when the deforming forces are removed. However, the result of applying a force beyond the elastic limit is that the soft tissue does not return to its original length when the deforming forces are removed. However, the result of applying a force beyond beyond the elastic limit is that the soft tissue does not return to its original length when the deforming forces are removed. The unrecoverable or permanent elongation in the soft tissue is called plasticity. When stress is applied beyond the elastic limit, deformation and force are no longer linearly proportional. When stress is applied beyond the elastic limit, deformation and force are no longer linearly proportional. I have no idea what that means. English! Do you speak it? I'm going to read that whole thing. The soft tissue of the kinetic chain demonstrates an elastic limit. So the soft tissue of the kinetic chain demonstrates an elastic limit, which is the smallest value of stress required to produce permanent strain in the tissue. Below this elastic limit, the soft tissue returns to its original length when the deforming forces are removed. However, the result of applying a force beyond the elastic limit is that the soft tissue does not return to its original length when the deforming forces are removed. The unrecoverable or permanent elongation in the soft tissue is called plasticity. The unrecoverable or permanent elongation in the soft tissue is called plasticity. When stress is applied beyond the elastic limit, deformation and force are no longer linearly proportional. Deformation and force are no longer linearly straight ahead, same line, proportional. Soft tissue properties: elastic, elasticity, viscosity, plasticity. Plasticity, the residual or permanent change in connective tissue length due to tissue elongation. Plasticity, the residual or permanent change in connective tissue length due to tissue elongation. Elastic limit, the smallest value of stress required to produce permanent strain in the tissue. Elasticity, the spring-like behavior of connective tissue that enables the tissue to return to its original shape or size when forces are removed. So you want good elasticity to prevent elastic limit and prevent plasticity. Viscoelasticity. Viscoelasticity. It's a fluid-like property of connective tissue that allows slow deformation with an imperfect recovery after the deforming forces are removed is known as viscoelasticity. So it's fluid-like property. The recovery occurs due to the elastic property of the connective tissue, but a lack of full recovery back to normal length is due to the viscous property of the connective tissue. The viscosity of the soft tissue is time dependent. The viscosity of the soft tissue is time dependent. The faster one tries to move, the greater the resistance to elongation. The viscosity of the soft tissue is time dependent. The faster one tries to move, the greater the resistance to elongation. The faster one tries to move, the greater the resistance to elongation. Proper warm-up and flexibility training reduces tissue viscosity and consequently improves the extensibility of the soft tissue. What is the extensibility? Proper warm-up and flexibility training reduces tissue viscosity and consequently improves the extensibility of the soft tissue. When subjected to loads for prolonged periods of time, the tissues adapt with plastic deformation. Memory tip. Elasticity is similar to a spring. You can compress it or stretch it, and it returns to its normal resting length. Viscoelasticity is similar to a foam pad. If you apply slow pressure to it, deformation will take place. Slowly, it will begin to return to its normal resting shape. Extreme pressure or long periods of pressure will permanently change the shape of the foam. Plasticity. Plasticity is similar to pulling on a soft plastic. You can pull it apart and it might not break, but it will never return to its normal form. Page 166, Chapter 4, Flexibility. When soft tissue permanently deforms in response to loading, it is said to have undergone plastic deformation. Consequently, there is no tendency for elastic recoil or recovery. Consequently, there is no tendency for elastic recoil or recovery. Plasticity is also referred to as the residual or permanent change in connective tissue length due to tissue elongation, as in flexibility training. Plasticity is also referred to as the residual or permanent change in connective tissue length due to tissue elongation, as in flexibility training. IFT increases elongation of the interstitial collagenous interfibril matrix, allowing a plastic deformation of the connective tissue. There needs to be an increase of approximately 3 to 5% in tissue length to elicit a plastic deformation in the soft tissue. There needs to be an increase of approximately 3 to 5% in tissue length to elicit a plastic deformation in soft tissue. Tissue overload and microfailure occur at approximately 6 to 10% tissue deformation. When forces exceed the tissue's adaptive potential, tissue microfailure occurs, and the microfailure contributes to the development of the cumulative injury cycle. One aspect of the cumulative injury cycle is the development of pro-inflammatory compounds, which stimulate nociceptors, leading to pain and development of protective muscle spasms. The chemical changes also lead to the development of fibrotic adhesions in the soft tissue within only 3 to 5 days following connective tissue insult. Chemical changes also lead to the development of fibrotic adhesions in soft tissue within only 3 to 5 days following connective tissue insult. Must be like an injury. These fibrotic adhesions form a weak, inelastic matrix in the connective tissue bundles, decreasing the normal tissue extensibility. This results in alteration of normal length tension relationships and the development of common muscle imbalances. The nature of soft tissue remodeling follows Davy's law that states soft tissue models along the lines of stress. The soft tissue equivalent of Wolff's law for bone. If soft tissue has an inelastic collagen matrix that forms in a random fashion, then if soft tissue has an inelastic collagen matrix, that forms in a random fashion, then alterations in normal tissue extensibility can result. The sports performance professional must follow the integrated flexibility continuum to restore the normal extensibility of the entire soft tissue complex. Neurophysiological principles of flexibility training. Muscle stretching or elongation essentially begin with sarcomere, the contractile element of the muscle. During contraction, the thin actin myofilament is pulled over the thick myosin myofilament via the myosin cross bridges, pulling the Z lines toward the center of the sarcomere, effectively shortening the short sarcomere. The initial length of the sarcomere largely dictates the tension produced. When the sarcomere is at less than its optimal length, the actin filaments can even overlap and produce less tension when stimulated because the sarcomere has less shortening capacity. The actin filaments can even overlap and produce less tension when stimulated because the sarcomere has less shortening capacity. With stretching, the overlap in the sarcomere decreases, which allows the muscle fiber to become closer to its original length and peak tension production possible. Possible goes up. With stretching, the overlap in the sarcomere decreases. We want this, which allows the muscle fiber to become closer to its optimal length and peak tension production possible. Peak its tension production as much as possible. Once the sarcomeres are fully stretched out, additional elongation comes from the surrounding connective tissue, fascia, and muscle tendons. Once the sarcomeres are fully stretched out, which you want, additional elongation comes from the surrounding connective tissue, fascia, muscle, and tendons. Since Davy's law states that soft tissue models along the lines of stress, an increase in scar tissue develops following an injury secondary to the cumulative injury cycle. Scar tissue has many inelastic properties, but will realign its fibers into functional lines of stress with proper flexibility training. Scar tissue has many inelastic properties, but it will realign its fibers into functional lines of stress with proper flexibility training. Integrated flexibility training. IFT not only affects the muscular system, but it also affects the neural system through two basic forms of feedback: recruitment and rate coding. Recruitment is an impulse transmitted simultaneously over an increasing number of nerve fibers, pulling in increasingly more muscle fibers for the task. This is sensitive to the stretch intensity and the number of fibers recruited. This is sensitive to the stretch intensity and the number of fibers recruited. For example, a moderate straight leg raise, hamstring stretch, will only stimulate a few stretch receptors. But as the stretch intensity increases, a greater number of receptors are stimulated. Rate coding is a time-sensitive feedback mechanism. This is the rate at which any individual nerve fiber transmits impulses per unit of time. This is the rate at which any individual nerve fiber transmits impulses per unit of time. As the stretch intensity increases, so does the frequency of impulses being sent to the spinal cord, which will usually result in some form of motor response, stretch reflex. Sensors within the musculotendinous unit provide the neural feedback. Sensors within the musculotendinous unit provide the neural feedback. These sensors are collectively called mechanoreceptors. There are three basic types of mechanoreceptors: muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, and joint receptors. Muscle spindles are the major sensory organs of the muscle and are composed of microscopic intrafusal fibers that lie in parallel to the extrafusal muscle fibers. Muscle spindles are sensitive to change in length and rate of the change. Muscle spindles are sensitive to change in length and rate. Muscle spindles are sensitive to change in length and rate of length change. How fast it is. GTO are Golgi tendon organs are located within the musculotendinosus junction. They are sensitive to tension and rate of tension change. Golgi tendon organs are located within the musculotendinous junction. They are sensitive to tension and rate of change. Prolonged GTO stimulation provides inhibitory action to muscle spindles located within the agonist muscle, which is called autogenic inhibition. Autogenic inhibition occurs when the neural impulses sensing tension are greater than the impulses causing muscle contraction. The phenomenon is termed autogenic because the contracting agonist is inhibited by its own receptors. Joint receptors. Joint receptors are located in joints throughout the fibrous capsule and ligaments. These receptors signal joint position, movement, and pressure. Autogenic inhibition occurs when the neural impulses sensing tension are greater than the impulses causing muscle contraction. The phenomenon is termed autogenic because the contracting agonist the phenomenon is termed autogenic because the contracting agonist is inhibited by its own receptors. This occurs when the neural impulses sensing tension are greater than the impulses causing muscle contraction. They need examples. No examples. The stretch reflex. The most basic reflex is the stretch reflex. The most basic reflex is neuronal circuit consisting of a sensory neuron and a motor neuron with its effector muscle. The most basic reflex is neuronal circuit consisting of sensory neuron and a motor neuron with its effector muscle. When a stimulus of sufficient intensity is applied to the receptor ending, an impulse is created. This impulse travels to the spinal cord where a motor neuron is excited. The nerve impulse is conducted to the effector site on the muscle and a motor response is initiated. The nerve impulse is conducted to the effector site on the muscle and a motor response is initiated. The reflex is a response to the stimulus. As the stimulus intensity increases, the motor response, the reflex, is proportional. When extrafusal muscle fibers are stretched, the intrafusal muscle spindles fibers are also stretched. These relay information regarding changes in muscle length and rate of change of muscle length. This information is relayed to the spinal cord, where a motor response contraction, also called myotic stretch reflex, occurs. This information is relayed to the spinal cord, where a motor response contraction, also called a myotic stretch reflex, occurs. When a muscle is stretched very quickly, the muscle spindles contracts, which in turn stimulates the primary afferent fibers. This causes the extrafusal fibers to fire and tension increases in the muscle, myotic stretch reflex. The rationale for holding a stretch position is to stimulate the Golgi tendon organ's inhibitory action to the muscle spindles, which will allow adaptive changes to the muscle spindle sensitivity to the new range. This myotic stretch reflex has static, tonic, and dynamic phasic components. The tonic portion remains as long as the stretch is active. The tonic portion remains as long as the stretch is active. The phasic component is proportional to the velocity of the stretch. The phasic component is proportional to the velocity of the stretch. An understanding of these principles, we don't, helps in the proper administration of successful. Yeah, who understands that? I mean, this is not properly. Okay, example. The myotic stretch reflex is tested when a physician taps on your knee with a small rubber hammer. By tapping on the patella tendon, a slight stretch is developed and pulls on the quadricep muscle. This, in turn, activates the muscle spindles, causing the quadriceps to contract due to the assumed change in the length of the quadriceps quickly. The contraction causes the knee kick, demonstrating effective function of the myostatic stretch reflex. The contraction causes the knee to kick, demonstrating effective function of the myotic stretch reflex. Sports performance professional needs to understand the different types of flexibility training in order to prescribe appropriate program based on needs and goals. Figure 413 illustrates the different types of flexibility on the integrated flexibility continuum. There are three categories of flexibility: corrective flexibility, active flexibility, and functional flexibility. Integrated flexibility continuum on the top: corrective flexibility, active flexibility, and functional flexibility. Integrated flexibility continuum: corrective flexibility, active flexibility, and a functional. Can I get a functional? Corrective flexibility is designed to correct common postural dysfunctions, muscle imbalances, and joint dysfunctions. Corrective flexibility training incorporates self-myofascial release, static stretching, and neuromuscular stretching. Active flexibility is designed to improve soft tissue extensibility in all planes of motion by employing the neurophysiological principles of reciprocal inhibition. Active flexibility uses agonists and synergists to actively move a limb through a range of motion while the functional antagonists are being stretched. Active flexibility incorporates neuromuscular system and active isolated stretch. Functional flexibility. We all like a little functionality. Functional flexibility is designed to improve multiplanar soft tissue extensibility and provide optimum neuromuscular control throughout the full range of motion, while performing functional movements that use the body's muscle to control the speed, direction, and intensity of the stretch. Walking lunges with a rotation is a good example of functional flexibility exercises. Remember, all functional movements occur in all three planes of motion, and injuries most often occur in the transverse plane, twisting. If the appropriate soft tissue is not extensible through the full range of motion, the risk of injury may increase. Those with the least range of motion seem to have the most strain injuries. Work on that range of motion, you won't have strain injuries. Exercise that can increase multiplanar soft tissue extensibility and have high levels of neuromuscular demands are preferred. Exercises that increase multiplanar soft tissue extensibility and have high levels of neuromuscular demand are preferred. Types of stretching. A broad range of improvements in soft tissue extensibility and correction of muscle imbalances will result when each individual is exposed to exercises across the integrated flexibility continuum. So it's a graph: integrated flexibility continuum. Corrective flexibility consists of self-myofascial release, static stretching, neuromuscular stretching. In the middle is active flexibility. It's number 2. Self-myofascial release, active isolated stretching, neuromuscular stretching. And finally, functional flexibility, self-myofascial release, and dynamic stretching. SMR is self-myofascial release, is a flexibility technique that forces on the neural and fascial systems in the body. SMR concentrates on alleviating myofascial trigger points and areas of hyperirritability located within a band of muscles. This form of stretching incorporates the concept of autogenic inhibition to improve soft tissue extensibility. Once a sensitive region has been identified, a foam roller is held on that region for at least 30 seconds. Gives pictures. Pictures are fun. Chapter 4, static stretching. Static stretching combines low force and long duration movements. This form of flexibility utilizes the neurophysiological principles of the autogenic inhibition to improve soft tissue extensibility, allowing for relaxation and concomitant elongation of the muscle. It is theorized this form of flexibility decreases muscle spindle activity and motor neuron excitability. It is theorized that this form of flexibility increases muscle spindle activity and motor neuron excitability. Proper performance of static stretching requires holding the stretch at the first point of tension or resistance barrier for 30 seconds. Active isolated stretching. Active isolated stretching processes use agonists and synergists to dynamically move the joint through a range of motion. This creates reciprocal inhibition of the functional antagonists that result in greater range of motion. The supine straight leg raise stretch uses the quadriceps and hip flexors to stretch the hamstrings and is an example of active stretching. One would perform 1 or 2 sets, holding each stretch for 1 to 2 seconds for 5 to 10 reps. So examples, active stretch. Gastrocnemius, supination, pronation, pictures. Pro tip, as a warm-up, static stretching prior to a strength training routine or competition should only be used in areas that determine tighten overactively. Static stretching, if incorporated before the strength workout as a warm-up prior to competition, should be followed by active isolated and or dynamic stretching to improve neuromuscular efficiency. Static stretching should be used post-workout or event and return muscles to normal resting lengths. Should be performed on the major muscles used during the workout or event. Static stretching is contraindicated prior to activities requiring maximal effort unless muscle imbalances are present. Active isolated and or dynamic. Active isolated and or dynamic stretching can be used as a warm-up by themselves if no muscle imbalances are present. As a warm-up after static stretching if muscle imbalances are present prior to activities requiring maximal effort. PNF, pro tip. PNF neuromuscular control stretching can be used by professionals trained in the technique that include hold, contract, relax, contract, relax, contract, contract, relax, contract techniques. Neuromuscular stretching is based on influencing the neurophysiological mechanisms, autogenic inhibition, and reciprocal inhibition. The basis for NMS involves the sports performance professional passively moving the limb until the first resistance barrier is noted. The athlete then applies an agonist contraction. The athlete then applies an agonist contraction of 25% maximal resistance, lasting 7 to 15 seconds. After relaxation of a brief isometric contraction, the limb, after relaxation or brief isometric contraction, the limb is moved into a newly created range of motion with assistance from the individual and held for 30 seconds. This is repeated 3 times. Caution! Avoid bouncing with stretches. This could cause the athlete to push too far beyond the stretch reflex, leading to injury. Make sure the stretch is held long enough. If the stretch is not at least 15 to 20 seconds, the athlete may not get a habit of brushing. Don't stretch too hard, don't stretch too hard, don't forget a form. Dynamic stretching. The use of muscles' own force production in the body's momentum to take a joint through the full available range of motion is dynamic stretching. Prisoner squats are an example of controlled dynamic stretching. The goal of any flexibility routine is to create multiplanar soft tissue extensibility that is controlled by the central nervous system. Though there are many types of flexibility training, no single method can improve every flexibility deficit. The best flexibility program follows integrated flexibility continuum. When evidence-based application of integrated flexibility